They thought they could survive without Filipinos. They were wrong. Hospitals collapsed, businesses shut down, economies suffered. These 10 nations made the mistake of kicking out one of the most hardworking, dedicated, and skilled workforces in the world, and they paid the price. Now, they're begging to bring Filipinos back, but is it too late? Let's find out. Stay till the end, because the #1 country on this list faced a crisis so severe it nearly collapsed their entire system. And if you think Filipinos deserve more respect, smash that like button and let the world know New Zealand's green pastures and rolling farmlands were once a gold mine. The country's dairy industry thrived, and Filipino workers were the backbone of it all. But then, disaster struck. In 2018, New Zealand's government introduced stricter visa policies. Suddenly, thousands of Filipino farmhands, experts in dairy production, were locked out. At first, local farmers thought they could manage. They were wrong. Crops started rotting in the fields. Dairy production nosedived, and profits gone. Desperate, farmers sounded the alarm. They begged the government to reconsider. We need them back or we're finished. By 2020, things hit a breaking point. Milk shortages spiked, export numbers plummeted, some farms shut down entirely. And then in 2021, the unthinkable happened. New Zealand quietly reversed its policies, reopening doors to Filipino workers. It was an admission of failure, a realization that the economy simply couldn't function without them. But was it too late? Farms had already collapsed. Millions were lost, and the scars still remain. This wasn't just a policy mistake, it was a cautionary tale. One decision wiped out an industry overnight. And the question remains, could it happen again? Drop your thoughts in the comments, and if you think this was shocking, wait until you see number 14. Hit subscribe so you don't miss it. Australia, a land of opportunity, where immigrants helped build the nation from the ground up. For decades, Filipino workers played a crucial role, filling essential jobs in healthcare, construction, and hospitality. But then, everything changed. In 2017, the government tightened its visa rules. Thousands of Filipino caregivers, skilled builders, restaurant staff were suddenly shut out. At first, no one panicked. Australia was a strong, self-sufficient economy. Surely things would be fine. But reality hit hard. Hospitals overflowed with patients, but there weren't enough nurses. Construction sites sat abandoned because no one was there to finish them. Hotels and restaurants turned away customers because there was no one to serve them. And then came the breaking point, 2020. When the world was brought to its knees, Australia realized the full cost of its mistake. A healthcare system on the brink, an economy suffocating. They needed workers, fast. Desperation set in. The government rushed to reverse its policies. They reopened their doors to Filipino laborers. The very people they had pushed away, they were now begging to return. But was it too late? Some businesses never recovered. Some families lost everything. Some wounds may never heal. A single policy shift brought a nation to its knees. And the question lingers, what if they had never shut the doors in the first place? Your thoughts, drop them in the comments. And if you think this was intense, just wait until you see number 13. Smash that like button so you don't miss what's next. Imagine this, you've saved up for years to take your dream vacation to Spain. Sunny beaches, world-famous paella, and a 5-star hotel with breathtaking views. But when you arrive, something feels off. The hotel lobby is a mess. The front desk has a long line with just one stressed out employee handling everything. Room service, non-existent. Restaurants closed early due to staffing shortages. You think, maybe I just picked the wrong hotel, but no, this is happening everywhere. What happened? Spain made a massive mistake. For decades, Spain's hospitality and healthcare industries thrived, thanks to Filipino workers. They ran the hotels, they took care of the elderly, they kept the system alive. But in the mid-2000s, Spain's government thought, why rely on foreign labor? Let's tighten work permits and hire locals instead. Sounds good in theory, right? Wrong. Hotels couldn't find experienced staff. Restaurants lost their best chefs and servers. And hospitals? Patients waited hours, sometimes days, for care. Take Rafael, a retired Spanish businessman. In 2012, his health started failing. He needed daily care, but his local hospital was overwhelmed. His family could only find one available nurse for 5 other patients. His daughter remembers that night vividly. Dad was in pain, we pressed the call button, no one came. And he wasn't alone. Across Spain, families struggled to find care, restaurants cut menus, tourism suffered. By 2015, Spain quietly reversed course. They begged Filipino workers to return. But the damage was done. Many had moved elsewhere, and Spain's economy paid the price. The lesson: never take workers for granted. One decision nearly collapsed an entire nation's workforce, and today, with labor shortages rising worldwide, some countries are making the same mistake all over again. But here's the real question. Could your country be next? Drop a fire emoji in the comments if you think governments are ignoring the real workforce crisis, and if you think this was shocking, just wait until you see number 12. Smash that like button because what's coming next will leave you speechless. Alright, picture this. It's 2015 and you're rushing your kid to the ER because they decided to see if they could fly off the garage roof. Classic. You arrive expecting the usual chaotic but efficient emergency room. Instead, you find a waiting area packed like a can of sardines with a frazzled nurse announcing the current wait time is approximately 12 hours. Wait, what? 12 hours for a broken arm? What on earth happened? For decades, Filipino nurses have been the unsung heroes of the American healthcare system. They've filled critical roles, especially in underserved areas, providing compassionate and skilled care. But in the 2010s, someone up in the policy-making clouds thought, hey, let's reduce work visas. We've got plenty of American nurses to cover. Spoiler alert, we didn't. Almost overnight, hospitals found themselves in a staffing nightmare. Wards were understaffed, remaining nurses were overworked, and patient care took a nosedive. Nurses began leaving the profession faster than you can say stat, leading to a vicious cycle of shortages and burnout. Let's talk about Sarah. She's a single mom and a dedicated nurse in a Midwestern hospital. With the visa reductions, her unit lost half its staff. Sarah started pulling double shifts, missing her kids' soccer games and bedtime stories. One night, after a 16-hour shift, she made a medication error. Thankfully, it was caught in time, but it was a wake-up call. She realized she couldn't continue like this and left nursing altogether. The numbers don't lie. According to a 2024 editorial in the Boston Globe, the US is facing a nursing shortage that's only getting worse. Nationally, about 1/5 of registered nursing positions in home healthcare and nursing homes are unfilled. Massachusetts hospitals alone spent $100 million last year hiring temporary registered nurses to fill vacancies. By 2018, the US government had a classic "we've made a huge mistake" moment. They scrambled to reverse the visa restrictions, practically rolling out the red carpet for Filipino nurses, but the damage was done. It turns out, when you treat essential workers as expendable, they find opportunities elsewhere. This wasn't just a bureaucratic oopsie. It had real-world consequences. Patients suffered from delayed care, medical errors increased, and the overall trust in the healthcare system took a hit, all because of a short-sighted policy change. So, what do you think? Are we doomed to repeat these mistakes, or can we learn and adapt? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. Let's get this conversation rolling. Stay tuned. And if you thought this was eye-opening, just wait until you see what's coming up in 11. Trust me, you won't want to miss it. Hit that subscribe button and ring the bell so you're the first to know when it drops. Imagine this, your dad clutches his chest in pain, you rush him to the hospital expecting urgent care, but instead you're told there's no nurse available right now, you'll have to wait. Minutes feel like hours. His breathing gets weaker. You beg for help, but the nurses are already overwhelmed, running on fumes. And that's when it hits you. Canada's healthcare system is in deep trouble. For decades, Filipino nurses kept Canada's hospitals running. They filled critical roles, cared for seniors, and worked the shifts locals wouldn't. But then, in the mid-2000s, some official, probably sitting comfortably in an office, decided, let's make it harder for foreign nurses to work here. We'll prioritize Canadian workers instead. Sounds good in theory, right? In reality, it was a disaster. Work permits became impossible to get, immigration slowed, and foreign-trained nurses who had years of experience were told they needed to spend thousands of dollars just to re-qualify. By 2020, Canada was short over 60,000 nurses. Hospitals were drowning in staff shortages. ER wait times jumped to 12 hours, surgeries were delayed, and overworked nurses quit in droves. In nursing homes, seniors suffered. Patients were left in soiled beds for hours. Some went without medication because there weren't enough hands to help. And guess who suffered the most? Regular people, families like yours who trusted Canada's healthcare system to be there when it mattered most. Maria was one of the nurses Canada desperately needed, but pushed away. She arrived in Canada with 10 years of experience, ready to work, but instead of stepping into a hospital, she was told her credentials weren't recognized, She needed years of extra schooling, and she had to pay tens of thousands of dollars to qualify. So instead of saving lives, Maria ended up stacking shelves in a grocery store. Does that sound like a system that works? By 2023, Canada was in crisis mode. Alberta scrambled to fix the damage, throwing $7,800,000 into a fast-track program for internationally trained nurses. They even offered $30,000 in financial aid just to get them back. But the real question is, was it too late? Canada isn't the only country that made this mistake, but is this fix enough, or is the system still broken? Smash that like button if you think nurses deserve better. Drop a comment if you've ever waited hours in an ER, and hit subscribe, because next we're diving into another country's labor disaster. And trust me, it's even worse. Stay tuned. This is just getting started. What if your aging parents right now had no one to care for them? No one to cook their meals, help them bathe, or even remind them to take their medicine? What if they were left alone, forgotten? But that's exactly what happened in Italy. Thousands of elderly Italians, many in their 80s and 90s, were suddenly abandoned, not by choice, but by policy. Italy has one of the oldest populations in Europe, with nearly 24% of Italians over 65. For decades, Filipino caregivers were the unsung heroes, stepping in where families couldn't. They did more than just work. They became family. They cooked meals, provided medical care, and most importantly, offered love and companionship to seniors who would otherwise be alone. But then, Italy made a terrible mistake. In an attempt to control immigration, Italy restricted work permits and visas. Thousands of Filipino caregivers, some who had cared for the same families for years, were suddenly forced to leave. At first, the government believed that local workers would step in. They didn't. Families scrambled to find caregivers, but it wasn't just about filling a job, it was about finding people with the patience, dedication, and cultural warmth that Filipinos naturally brought. The result? A crisis. Elderly Italians were left helpless. Hospitals were overwhelmed with seniors needing care. Many were left in poor living conditions, neglected and isolated. And the saddest part? Many of them never recovered. 3 years later, Italy faced a harsh reality. The elderly care system was collapsing, and families were begging for help. Realizing their mistake, the Italian government rushed to fix their policies, quietly loosening immigration rules to bring Filipino caregivers back. Suddenly, visas were easier to get, new programs were introduced, and just like that, Italy admitted something they had once denied. Filipinos weren't just workers, they were essential. Was this too little, too late, and could this happen again? Smash that like button if you think caregivers deserve more recognition. Drop a comment if you've ever seen how vital they are in your own community. And stay tuned, you won't believe what happened next. What if one government decision suddenly made your entire livelihood disappear? One moment, your job is secure. The next, you're on the outside looking in, wondering how you'll survive. That's exactly what happened to Manuel, a Filipino factory worker in South Korea. For nearly a decade, he worked in an electronics plant assembling components for some of the world's biggest brands: Samsung, LG, Hyundai. Manuel wasn't just earning for himself, he was sending money home to his wife and 3 kids in the Philippines. That paycheck put food on their table, paid for school fees, and gave his family a shot at a better life. But then in the early 2010s, everything changed. South Korea tightened its visa rules, limiting the number of foreign workers like Manuel. We want more jobs for South Koreans, the government claimed, but they never asked South Koreans if they actually wanted those jobs. Almost overnight, thousands of Filipinos lost their work permits. Manuel was one of them. He had no choice but to leave. No job, no income, his kids' education at risk. Years of sacrifice gone in an instant. And here's the real kicker. The South Koreans they expected to replace Filipinos, they didn't want the jobs. Factories sat empty, production lines slowed to a crawl, companies lost millions, and South Korea, a country built on efficiency, was falling apart. By 2015, the crisis was undeniable. Factory owners panicked, the economy took a hit, and the government, they had to admit their mistake. By 2016, South Korea reopened work permits for Filipinos, but now they had to beg workers to return. Higher wages, better contracts, faster visa processing. South Korea went from pushing Filipinos out to desperately trying to bring them back. And Manuel, he returned, but not without scars. I lost years of opportunity. I had to start over, he says. It wasn't just a job, it was my family's future. What do you think? Did South Korea learn its lesson, or could this happen again? Drop a comment if you've seen a country suffer from a labor shortage. Smash that like button if you believe workers deserve better treatment. Have you ever felt the ground shift beneath your feet when something you relied on suddenly disappears? Imagine being a busy parent in Hong Kong, juggling work and home, only to have your trusted caregiver vanish overnight. For decades, Filipino domestic workers were the heartbeat of Hong Kong's households. They weren't just employees, they were family, the quiet force that kept every home running smoothly. But in 2017, Hong Kong's government decided to experiment with new hiring policies, pushing employers to source domestic help from other countries. Let me share the story of Elaine, a devoted mother of two. Elaine had trusted her Filipino caregiver Liza for over a decade. Liza knew every family member's routine, prepared authentic home-cooked meals, and ensured that elderly relatives received tender care. When the new policy forced Elaine's employer to replace Liza with a caregiver from another country, everything changed. The newcomer struggled with basic tasks. Missed medication schedules, poorly prepared meals, and a lack of understanding of local customs left Elaine's household in disarray. The chaos wasn't just inconvenient, it disrupted daily life and left deep emotional scars. Families soon discovered that the cost-saving switch was a costly mistake. Complaints mounted as inexperienced caregivers couldn't meet the high standards set by their Filipino predecessors. Employers found themselves paying extra just to bring Filipino workers back. By 2019, facing mounting real-world consequences and widespread outcry, Hong Kong reversed its policy, proving once and for all that no one does it better than Filipinos. Smash that like button if you believe quality care is irreplaceable. Drop a comment with your experiences or thoughts. What happens when the people who hold a nation together are suddenly locked out? For decades, Singapore's healthcare system and households thrived because of one crucial workforce: Filipino nurses and domestic helpers. They weren't just employees, they were lifelines for hospitals, elderly patients, and families. But in 2020, everything fell apart. When COVID-19 struck, Singapore shut its borders, severing the flow of Filipino workers overnight. The result? Chaos. Hospitals were drowning. ICU beds were full, yet there weren't enough nurses to attend to critical patients. Elderly care homes became ghost towns, with overworked staff struggling to feed and bathe residents. Families panicked as they scrambled to find help for their children and aging parents. Then, the worst moment, a breaking point. A top Singaporean hospital issued an emergency call for staff pleading for reinforcements. But there were none. No Filipino nurses, no caregivers. Only a system on the brink of collapse. By 2021, Singapore had no choice but to backtrack. The government rushed to reopen recruitment for Filipino workers, offering higher wages and faster visas just to get them back. The irony? They never should have left in the first place. Lesson learned? Some jobs aren't replaceable, they're indispensable. Hit that like button if you believe frontline workers deserve more respect, and drop a comment. What would you do if your country lost its healthcare workers overnight? Don't go anywhere, because next we're exposing an even bigger labor disaster that will leave you stunned. Stay tuned. Japan, the land of cherry blossoms, futuristic tech, and some of the longest living people on the planet. Sounds great, right? But what happens when those people start aging faster than anyone can take care of them? For decades, Filipino caregivers stepped in where Japan's workforce fell short. They weren't just workers, they became family. But in 2010, Japan made a decision that would come back to haunt them. Stricter work requirements slammed the door shut on thousands of Filipino caregivers. Suddenly, visas were harder to get, language exams were a nightmare, and Japan's aging population was left stranded. And that's when things started falling apart. Hospitals filled up not with the sick, but with elderly patients who had nowhere else to go. Nursing homes had more empty caregiver positions than they had staff, and families were left scrambling, quitting their jobs just to care for their loved ones. It was an economic disaster in disguise, one that no one wanted to talk about. Let's talk about Aiko Tanaka. She was 47 when she had to give up her career in Tokyo to care for her father full-time. There was no one left to help, she said. I had no choice. She's not alone. Millions of Japanese families were pushed into the same situation. And then the numbers hit. By 2018, Japan was 200,000 caregivers short. Desperate, the government reversed course, scrambling to bring Filipino caregivers back. Visas were fast-tracked, policies were relaxed, salaries went up. But here's the real kicker. Was it too late? Some elderly never got the care they needed. Families suffered years of burnout. And Japan, it learned the hard way that when you push away the very people keeping your nation afloat, the consequences are brutal. What do you think? Should governments prioritize skilled foreign workers when their own workforce can't keep up? Drop a comment below and don't go anywhere.